All right, so this will be video 2 on the amendments. This will go through numbers 11 through 27. So there's a lot of them. But at the end of the day, if you think about it, it's not a whole lot because our first 10 amendments were written immediately when the Constitution was passed, essentially. So there's only been, 27 total amendments, so 17 other amendments since the late 1700s. So in our country's history, we haven't had to add to our Constitution all that many times. All right, so number 11, I put the dates here so you can see we'll go in chronological order, and you can see as the years go by when these amendments took place. A lot of times they took place because of the historical things going on in the country at the time or in the world. So the 11th Amendment was to make sure that if someone from a state wanted to sue another state for whatever reason it might be, that state did something against that person's rights, so they want to sue. I live in Illinois, I want to sue the state of Wisconsin, let's say. I cannot do that in the federal courts. Those have to take place in that state's court where the lawsuit is being filed. So this is just a way to make sure that the states can kind of take care of themselves without the federal government intervening and kind of abusing their power all the time. 12th Amendment was 1804. This established that, like it says, the president and the vice president would be elected together. So this was kind of an issue they found out pretty quick in our Constitution. The way the election process worked is in the Electoral College, it was whoever took first place and then second place would be the president and vice president. So as you can see in those first couple elections there in 1796, or two of the early elections in our country's history, first and second place in 1796, you had members of two different parties being the president and vice president. So that would essentially have been like today, or in the year 2016 election, President Trump being the president and then Hillary Clinton being the vice president. All right. Or in this next election, Trump being president and, Bernie Sanders being vice president, or Bernie Sanders being president and Trump being the vice president in the upcoming election. So that didn't work out too well. And then you can see in the 1800 election, you had two people from the same party tie in electoral votes. So essentially they took first, second. So you had two people that were going against each other, ultimately would have been the president and the vice president. So the 12th Amendment said, once you choose to run for presidency, you're going to choose who your vice president is, and that person automatically is chosen with you as the vice president of the winning candidate. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These are going to be our civil rights amendments during the slavery issue, all right, around the Civil War time. So Civil War era, all right, the war started over slavery issues. So the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, so it ends the idea of slavery in the United States. 14th Amendment identified, okay, these people that were former slaves now have certain rights under the Constitution, because what was happening is, the northern states a lot were identifying the former slaves as citizens, but the southern states were saying, well, yeah, you can say they're not slaves no more, but we're not going to count them as citizens, all right? So the 14th Amendment identified that regardless of your race, it identifies that if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. It says if you are a U.S. citizen, you get due process under the law, and then you get equal protection under the law. Okay, so there's three parts to the 14th Amendment, identifying what makes you a U.S. citizen, then also the fact that you get the same protections under the Constitution as any other citizen. Then the third of these is the 15th Amendment, which we always say gave African-American men the right to vote, which it does, all right? The language says that no longer in the United States can you be denied the right to vote based on your race, color, or statement there is important, previous conditions of servitude, so previous conditions of being a former slave. All right, so ultimately, who was it written for? It was written for African-American men at the time. Remember, women didn't have the right to vote at all, regardless of your race. If you're a woman, you didn't get the right to vote yet in 1870 in the United States. So the 15th Amendment gave African-American men the right to vote based on the language that was used in the words of the actual amendment. 16th Amendment, all right, for those of you that have a job and you look at your pay stub, you always notice that you have federal income tax withheld. Well, you can thank the 16th Amendment for that, because this is what gives the federal government the power. It wasn't until 1913 that the federal government is given the power to actually collect income tax from Americans out of your pay based on how much money you make. Prior to the 16th Amendment, they could tax things you own, like your property and stuff like that, but they weren't allowed to tax your income. So this went to the Supreme Court, Eventually, the 16th Amendment had to be written in order to give the federal government the right to tax your income. 17th Amendment, all right, this ultimately expands your power in elections as a voter. All right, prior to the 17th Amendment, you would vote for members of the House, but the 100 senators would actually be chosen by the state legislatures of each state. All right, so you would choose who your U.S. House of Representatives were representing Illinois, and then you would vote for who was going to represent you down in Springfield, in the state capital of Illinois. Well, those people you voted for down in Springfield would then choose who those 2 U.S. senators would be from the state of Illinois. All right, you didn't actually vote for those people. All right, so the purpose of that concept was to give the states more power, all right, over who was going to be represented in the federal government. All right, by 1913, the people said, you know what, we're educated enough, we should be able to make those decisions for ourselves. So they helped push through the 17th Amendment, which then allowed the people to choose the senators from each state. 18th Amendment, all right, this is the one that would eventually be repealed, but 18th Amendment was the Prohibition Amendment, so it made all alcoholic beverages illegal, all right? So after 1919, we can thank the 18th Amendment for some of the fun stories about the Al Capones of the world and the bootleggers moving illegal liquor and the speakeasies where people would go and dance and drink and illegally, in hitting clubs. And that's what was going on for those years that Prohibition took place. So ultimately, you can thank Prohibition for, the gangs of Al Capone's time era and things like NASCAR, because the bootleggers used to go and race their bootleg vehicles to outrun the police. All right, so they'd go race them on the weekends, and they'd start racing in an oval track or a circle track, and years later, we got this thing called NASCAR. 19th Amendment, give women the right to vote. So, crazy to think about that. It took till 1920 to give women the right to vote. So, one of the things I always like to point out is this is why we have the amendment process, all right, to make sure that when there's major issues in our country, like slavery, like, groups not being able to vote, we can use the amendment process to fix some of the errors in the Constitution, okay? Now, the power of voting was given not to the federal government. The states automatically got that power based on the 10th Amendment, right? We just talked about that if it's not given to the federal government, that power automatically belongs to the states. Sorry, guys, had to pause there. Dogs were barking. All right, so the 19th Amendment ultimately gave women the right to vote because the states had the power of vote, of elections. So in order to make it for a law for the entire country, since it was not a federal power, they had to amend the Constitution to give women the right to vote. So by 1920, there's a handful of states that were allowing women the right to vote in the state, individual states, but not in the country as a whole. So some states were allowing it, some weren't. So ultimately, we had to make an amendment to make sure it was all women, regardless of what state you lived in, you got the right to vote. 20th Amendment, all right, to shorten the time period, it's kind of a weird one, but it makes sense, all right? So prior to the 20th Amendment, when you had the presidential election and the election for congressmen and women in November, it wasn't until the following March 4th that they actually took office. So the 20th Amendment shortened that time period because by 1933, the advent of transportation, like trains and stuff, not so much air travel, but trains made it quicker and easier to move people, and after elections to know, who won the elections. That was done a lot faster by 1933. So they didn't need that much time. All right. So they decided, let's move this up. So after an election, the president and vice president would take office on January 20th from that point on instead of March 4th. And the new Congress would take office January 3rd following that November instead of March 4th. Because what we call it was a lame duck group of presidents and congressmen who had lost an election or were no longer be in that position. And from November till March 4th, they knew they lost. So you got November, not all of November, but you have all of December, January, and February. So you have over 3 months of time that these people who weren't going to be part of the next session of Congress or not the next president or vice president would be there, and essentially nothing would get done. So they call it lame duck time, where your job's done, so you're not really doing anything in those remaining months of your job. All right, 21st Amendment, pretty simple. This is repealed the 18th, so it allowed alcohol to be consumed again in the United States. But ended the Prohibition era. 22nd Amendment, all right, this comes in 1951, so it comes a few years after the man in the picture there, FDR, had died in the presidency. But FDR was elected to the president 4 times. He didn't serve all 4 terms. He died in the 4th term, but he was elected 4 times. So prior to him, no one ever was elected to more than 2 terms. So it was always George Washington stepped aside after a 2nd term and kind of set the precedence of how he wanted all future presidents to assume that role and not go for a 3rd or 4th term, because he didn't want it to become more like a king. And he wanted the presidents to eventually walk away and let someone else take that power. But during the Great Depression and World War II going on, FDR was able to get reelected, not just 2 times, but a 3rd and a 4th time. So after his presidency was over, went to the amendment process to say, okay, well, let's set it at 2 terms, because we don't want future presidents to be able to serve for more than those 2 terms. 23rd Amendment, all right, this is prior to the 23rd Amendment, if you lived in Washington, D.C., you were not able to vote in presidential elections. So the 23rd Amendment allows all people in D.C. to also have a voice in the presidential election. So they included Washington, D.C. residents as part of the Electoral College, and they were given 3 electoral votes so that their votes counted for something during the presidential elections. All right, 24th Amendment outlawed the use of poll taxes. So prior to the 24th Amendment, depending on the location, some places would charge you to vote. All right, now they usually did this in places like the South against African-American voters. All right, so remember by 1964, obviously, all men and women had the right to vote by this point. But up until basically from 1860s all the way until 1960s, they were trying to do things in the South more than the North to keep the African-American voter from being able to exercise their right. So something like making them pay in order to vote. And they used other things called the Jim Crow laws at that time to keep them from being able to exercise the right to vote. So the 24th Amendment just puts an end to all of that and says, you know what, no more poll taxes. It's not legal to charge someone to vote in an election. 25th Amendment, this is our Presidential Succession Amendment. So this identifies, this is shortly after JFK was assassinated. So we always just kind of assume that the vice president would take over, but the 25th Amendment lays out all the succession order. So from the vice president to the Speaker of the House to the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then the Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, and then all the other 16 department secretaries would be on this list. All right, so ultimately the 25th Amendment identified what is that order. If this person dies and then this person dies, or something awful happens in our country where multiple of them die at the same time, who would be the next in line to be president. All right, they did a show about this called Designated Survivor, which is actually based on a true concept, not a true story, but a true concept, where anytime that they're having a speech at Congress where the president, the vice president, speaker, where everyone's going to be there, they pick one person, one of the secretaries is chosen to be the designated survivor. He or she is not allowed in the building, just in case something crazy happens and everyone in that building is killed or dies from some disaster. That designated survivor was pulled off to the side and wouldn't be there, and they would then be put in place as the president. So it's kind of an interesting concept that they actually do when there's a thing like the State of the Union address, let's say, that the president's giving. All right, this also allows them to decide if a president is incapacitated, they call it, not able to actually act as the president, they can invoke the 25th Amendment. This could be used, let's say, if a president is, has to have surgery or something like that, or has a heart attack or something happens and they just can't be the president, they don't have the ability to, or if something happens where they don't have the mental capacity to do it, Congress and the cabinet and the members of basically the presidential executive branch can come together and say, okay, we're going to invoke the 25th Amendment and decide that the next person in the line of succession would be the president. 26th Amendment, all right, lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. All right, so this took place, if you look at the date, matches up with the Vietnam War era. So these soldiers were old enough to go fight, but they weren't old enough to vote. So they'd be serving for possibly 3 years in Vietnam, being sent to go fight by our Congress and president, but they didn't even have the right to vote for those people that were sending them to fight. So kind of a simple concept, right? If you're old enough to fight, like the pin there says, you're old enough to vote. And the last amendment, 27th Amendment, was from 1992. This had to do with congressional salaries. So Congress has to vote on their own pay raises, which is kind of interesting if you think about it, voting to give yourself a raise. So basically what this amendment said is if they decide to give themselves a raise, the raise doesn't go into effect until after the next election. So if I'm a congressman and I say I want a raise, and I vote yes on a raise, my raise doesn't go in until the next time I'm elected. So I still have to run for one more election cycle to earn that raise. All right, so I have to win another election to get that raise, in other words. Okay, so and you can kind of see this schedule here. It shows you how much the salaries of the Congress has changed over the years. Currently, they make about $174,000 a year, each congressman and woman does, and that's gone up, pretty much from the 1970s, we'll say, up until 2009. It's gone up pretty significantly. All right, so that is our amendments. If you have any questions on any of those, go back and rewatch the video or shoot me an email and ask me what you got.